Hi everyone, we're going to get started. Welcome to a Mercy Model in Schools webinar, When an Apple Isn't Enough, Tools to Thrive Through Classroom Challenges. We're going to pull the webcam up so you can see us for a minute as we introduce ourselves. As you are joining us, please make sure you're joining in listen only mode. Here we are. Hi everyone. My name is Andrea Simari Rosenberg. I am the supervisor of Mercy Model in Schools at Mercy Home for Boys and Girls. I'm a former teacher and have worked with youth from elementary school and high school for about 7 years. This is my colleague, Liz.
Hi everyone, I'm Liz Tomka and I am a licensed clinical social worker. I've been working at Mercy Home most recently for 8 academic years, and prior to that worked in a high school for 5 years as a school social worker. And so I'll be the second presenter on today's webinar, and I'll talk a little bit more about my personal experience in relation to self-care.
So thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to get going here with the PowerPoint as people come on. We're going to take off this webcam for a minute. You'll see us at the end of the presentation here. Please make sure, as I said, you've joined in listen only mode. This webinar will be recorded. Please familiarize yourself with the dashboard, including knowing how to raise your hand. You can ask questions through there, and you can also chat with us. You should see a message that says, welcome everyone. So please at this time, just to make sure everyone can hear us, please raise your hand if you can hear us. Okay, so we have several hands raised. We can see you. So if you can't hear us, you may have us on mute. So make sure you haven't muted us on your computer. So turn your sound on your desktop. So we're going to get going. Feel free to ask questions throughout. We will save, if it's a really good one, we'll save it to the end to answer it, or the other presenter can answer through text here. And you can also chat if you have any questions about how the functionality of GoToWebinar, and we can help you out there. As we get going, we want to introduce Mercy Home. So Mercy Home was established in 1987 as an orphanage for homeless boys. We've expanded in the last few decades to also include girls, and now we're really a residential treatment facility with 2 campuses serving approximately 134 youth. Mercy Home isn't just residential though. We have supports for our residents who are no longer living with us, but living out in the community. We also have a mentorship program that helps little lower risk youth in Chicago as well. We provide academic and career supports for the youth that live with us, and it's all under what we call the Mercy model of care, which includes milieu therapy, individual and group and family therapy. So we're really trying to provide supports for kids in crisis, for kids and their families in crisis in Chicago and Chicagoland. So if you have referrals, or if you kind of need solutions for the kids in your classroom, please feel free to reach out to us. The webinar today is presented by an initiative called Mercy Model in Schools. The Mercy Model in Schools initiative aims to lead efforts to promote relational, resilience-focused, and trauma-responsive practices in Chicagoland elementary and high schools. We provide teachers, staff, and leaders who are skilled at creating effective learning environments for all students, regardless of their trauma exposure. So a lot of what we'll talk about today works for all kids. Our programming includes on-site training at schools. I lead most of that training. This is Andrea, and I'd be happy to come to your school within the Chicagoland. We also have Mercy Home events at Mercy Home, so you can see our facilities and get a picture of how our kids live each day. We also have webinars like the one you're on right now. This is a third in the series of 4 webinars. And the last one will be in April on effective response to challenging behavior. just like you did possibly for this webinar, you can get more information about Mercy Model in Schools at our website that's there below. The learning objectives for today's webinar, When an Apple Isn't Enough, is to learn about vicarious trauma and its impact on educators. We'll look at some tools to regulate our emotional responses in the moment. We'll also create some self-care plans and look at how systems can support and avoid burnout. And then we'll take a moment to recognize how school culture impacts teacher wellness as well. So thanks for joining us. We're going to kick the webinar off by just defining trauma and adversity and give you a little bit of background on the Mercy Model in Schools framework, and then we'll dive into a particular skill. Liz will take over halfway through and talk about self-care in the classroom and kind of self-care overall. So trauma. When I mention trauma, I'm talking about overwhelming, uncontrollable experiences that psychologically impact victims by creating in them feelings of helplessness, vulnerability, loss of safety, and loss of control. If you've been to our webinars before, you've heard this before, but we always start with it as a basis of what our students and youth who live at Mercy Home are really going through. And I highlight the last 4 words in that definition on purpose because that's what our students are feeling in the moment when they go through a traumatic experience, but they're also carrying these feelings with them as they go throughout their day and walk into your classroom. There's a chance that there are students in your classroom who haven't experienced trauma, but have experienced adversity. So when adversity is an unfavorable or difficult situation or condition, this might be abuse or neglect as well, but I think a big one for adversity is household dysfunction. If a parent has a mental illness or substance abuse, oftentimes houses can be chaotic without necessarily being traumatic. So things to keep in mind, we're kind of setting the stage for the experiences our young people might be having outside of our classrooms and in our communities. So research is showing that the whole brain is impacted by trauma. What is going on outside the classroom is impacting our students inside the classroom. If a student experiences neglect at a young age, their brain is often wired for stress. And we know this impacts later in life, it impacts learning and it also impacts behavior. So our brains are wired in a use-dependent fashion. So the more the stress responses wires are traveled, the more easily they are triggered. Because of these stress responses, students have trouble often paying attention, right? That attention and focus. They may have trouble communicating their needs because they're not accessing that language core in their brain as often. They may experience a wide range of emotions throughout the day that they are unable to control. That's the emotional regulation. And we also may see issues with executive functioning, for example, like organization or decision making. We can also see more issues that trauma impacts their behavior. For example, if a student is living in a home with domestic violence, they may become very worried at night, and their behavior or academic performance the next morning is going to be affected. Without sleep, and when they're living in this state of anxiety, the functioning in the class, it's going to affect the functioning in the classroom the next day. So if you're interested in learning more about this, I really encourage you to check out our previous webinar, Engaging Students Who Have Been Impacted by Trauma. It's on our website, which was on the previous slide, because we're not really going to focus on the impact today, but really going to turn it around and focus on teachers and how to sustain ourselves and really respond effectively to the challenges we're seeing in the classroom. The ARC framework is a foundational framework that we use here at Mercy Home. There are 3 key domains, including attachment, regulation, and competencies. When we talk about attachment, we're talking about relational caregiving. Regulation, meaning emotional and physical wellness, and competencies are social and emotional skills. So the ARC is for attachment, regulation, and competencies. Today, as you can see, as I've highlighted with the yellow circle, we're going to focus on caregiver affect management, which is in the attachment domain. The great thing about the ARC model is that if we use it to guide our behavior in the classroom, it will really help all students. We don't need to think, okay, this student is traumatized, so this is how I should act with them. This using the principle of the Mercy model then becomes second nature, and we end up helping all of our students, not just those with a trauma history. If you're interested in learning more about the different blocks of the ARC model that are identified here, again, check out our webinar. We also have resources for how you can bring us to your school and learn more skills about the Mercy model. This is kind of an interpretation or a translation of the ARC model framework into something that's a little more accessible for teachers. So when I say caregiver affect management, we have a little catchphrase here in the box as well. It's check yourself before you wreck yourself. Manage your own emotional responses to student behavior. That's what we're focusing on today. As our title states, when an apple isn't enough, we know that teaching is really challenging and difficult. And I've definitely been in the classroom, especially in February and March. It gets especially difficult as it gets cloudy and the year drags on. And oftentimes, right, the typical teacher gift of an apple doesn't do enough to sustain us. So we're going to be talking about that today. How do we manage ourselves in the classroom in difficult times? And Liz will talk about the importance of kind of looking overall at your life and how you're managing and supporting yourself. And we say an apple isn't enough, but Liz will probably mention the importance of healthy snacks throughout the day as a way to sustain yourself. I know I like to keep a healthy snack as well. So the title is a little bit ironic. So caregiver affect management, our definition that we're going to be working with today is the ability to stay in control of one's behavior and not take acting out behavior personally. The key role for this is for, excuse me, for teachers to help students develop self-regulation skills. So this means help students manage their own emotions. In order to do this, we must first manage our own emotional responses to students. And this means sometimes not taking the acting out behavior personally. We know that as teachers, we are modeling for students every day. We're modeling how to do math problems, how to interpret the periodic table, and we also need to be modeling our emotional expression for them. This doesn't mean that we can't get angry or upset or frustrated. This means that when we do get angry, upset, and frustrated, we show them how to manage it in a healthy way. So we're gonna start off with a poll here about how we manage our responses when we face challenges from our students. So you should see a poll coming up on your screen. So we'd like you to think about for a moment, what is your response to student challenges that you face? And even though I think I only put response, you can click more than one. So at times, do you feel ineffective when you're experiencing challenges? Do you feel like, oh my goodness, these kids are too needy, they just need too much, I can't give them everything? Do you feel bad about hardships your students have experienced, and so on? So take a moment to fill that out. I see lots of people responding. Thanks for engaging with us here. All right, I'm going to close the poll in a moment so I can show you people's responses. All right, so it looks like at times many of us feel ineffective, which is very common. We also feel guilty, right, for how the hardships our students are experiencing, and I think that's really common as well. Some of us, about 22% of us are feeling like, oh my goodness, these kids are too needy and I can't give them everything. All of these are really common responses. I'm going to talk about them more, how we manage them. because they can impact our responses to kids in the classroom. So thanks for engaging in our poll. We should have the PowerPoint coming back up. So we're going to get going with our skills in the classroom and talk about that check yourself before you wreck yourself. This is our catchphrase here for caregiver affect management. To step out of the cycle of being frustrated, right, and responding to a student irrationally, we really need to take a moment and first regulate our own response. The reason we have the oxygen masks up there is because on the airplane, they always say, put your own oxygen mask before you assist others, right? Is we need to help ourselves. We need to regulate ourselves before we're assisting others. At Mercy Home, we have a saying, calm, connect, and respond. So we want to calm ourselves down. We want to connect with a student. We want to, it might be regulating them, making sure their whole brain is on and they're listening, able to listen to us. And then we want to respond, right? We don't want to react. The key here's kind of several key affect management skills that I'm gonna kind of take you through. I'm gonna hit kind of the first 4, and then Liz is gonna do a really thorough explanation of kind of the bottom 2 and even more than that. So the first one is pretty simple. I don't have a slide just for it, but it's on rational detachment. So we need to stay rationally detached from our work. And I know sometimes that's difficult for teachers because we are so invested in our work, but this does not mean, rational detachment means not taking student acting out behavior personally or in an offensive manner. Oftentimes we know it may be offensive to us, but we can't take it personally. If you've been in our previous webinars, you've known that there are reasons behind the way students act and why they're acting that way. And oftentimes it goes back to that trauma and adversity they've experienced. And if we do all that we can to be thoughtful about how we respond to students, that's the best that we can do. So for rational detachment, we use the acronym QTIP, quit taking it personally. It's oftentimes hard, especially when we're feeling ineffective. But if we're thinking about how we can be successful and having confidence in our skills, we're really doing the best we can. I'll continue kind of throughout this list in the next few slides. And you'll get this PowerPoint as a handout next week. We'll send it to you via email. And it can kind of help you track where we are. So we're going to talk about getting curious about student behavior first. So, what student behaviors challenge a teacher's ability to manage their own emotions, right? There are lots of them. So one of the really helpful tools is really getting curious about these behaviors that affect us. So we need to recognize what kind of student behavior gets in our way or makes your classroom, it makes it difficult for you to manage your own emotions. So I encourage you to think for a moment before I put all of my bullet points up on the slide about the behaviors that might get in your way. So these are the behaviors that we've come up with, that we've seen students present in the classroom that can be challenging, right? So anger, opposition, right? And defiance is a big one. Sometimes teachers tell me they're not sure what to say when a student says no to them. Right? Demand for attention. We know a lot of students need a lot of attention, right? And we can't always give it to them. Oftentimes our students have kind of extreme emotional responses to slight stressors, and that can then stress us. So we're gonna do, oh, sorry, I thought we had another poll, but we're gonna wait until the other one. So I hope you've started thinking about what type of student behavior is challenging for you in your classroom, because the first part is identifying it, and then we'll, really making a plan around it and how you're gonna respond to it. So these are some questions you can ask yourself when you have a challenging behavior. We're going to take I'm going to share one of my examples when I taught 3rd grade. I had a student, Lewis, who was constantly interrupting and yelling out answers to a point that I would get very frustrated throughout the day, and other students would get visibly frustrated and oftentimes telling him to stop. So we're going to take this as an example and kind of ask ourselves these questions to show you how it works. So sometimes I would get really upset and feel like he would keep interrupting and maybe he was doing it on purpose. And I felt like the more I got upset, the more he interrupted. So I hope you can kind of relate to me on this example. So thinking about these questions. So what need is the student trying to meet? It seemed as though Lewis was trying to get my attention, right? But also kind of prove himself to his classmates and kind of show that he had a lot of skills in a lot of areas, right? Kind of showing off. So what is the student trying to communicate with me? You know, I really think after looking back, Lewis was trying to tell me that he needed more positive reinforcement from me, possibly from his classmates, and most likely also from people at home. So what environmental issues were at play? You know, after students would see me get upset at Lewis, then I would see other students getting upset at him too, and it would kind of be a ripple effect. I didn't realize that at the time that I was modeling this incorrect behavior. I needed, you know, at the point to get my own emotional responses under control, and then I'm sure I would have then been modeling the correct responses for my other students. And finally, what skills is the student lacking is a big part, and how I'm going to address what I can do going forward. So really, in looking back, Lewis really needed some more help with his self-esteem, but also he needed some help with impulse control. So if I were to go back in my classroom now, you know, I could have provided him with like a stopwatch. You know, he could have waited 10 seconds, start the clock when you want to say something. When it gets to 10, you can raise your hand, right? That would have helped him with impulse control. If he needed more attention, I would have provided him with more positive reinforcement throughout the day. I could have also made a plan with him about, okay, in every lesson, I'm going to answer you can answer 2 questions or 3 questions, whatever might be appropriate. And that kind of could help us get through some of the lessons without him frustrating me, his classmates, but also he could then positively engage in my classroom. So after looking at student behavior, which is important, and kind of figuring out, asking yourself these questions, figuring out how you're going to respond, we then also want to look at our own behavior. So this kind of goes back to the poll I asked earlier about teacher responses, right? So some really common ones are a reduced sense of effectiveness, which like really our poll really showed, right? So teachers who work with youth who have experienced trauma and adversity, this is a really common response, is we don't feel like we're effective. We oftentimes can feel guilt or shame about these experiences, and that was 67% on our poll. I feel bad about the hardships my students have experienced. You know, it's easy to feel guilty about what's going on in their lives, and then sometimes we become overly permissive. So which is you know, that last one on there. We feel bad about what's going on with them, and so we don't correctly respond to them, or we don't give them limits. Really, we want to avoid all of these. If we focus on being compassionate and empathetic while making connections with students, but really importantly, we want to be consistent. We don't want to be angry and blame the child or overreact or permissive. We want to be somewhere in the middle. And this consistency can make our environment and relationships predictable and healthy. So I'm glad people really responded to this through the poll. It was, you know, helpful to kind of engage in the conversation. And I hope you're seeing how some of these experiences that we're feeling are totally normal, but also things we want to recognize in ourselves. So this is when we get to knowing your own triggers. So we've kind of talked about what your behavior looks like, and now we want to figure out what's triggering you in the classroom, what might be upsetting you. So we all have things that bother us. We need to distinguish these triggers from things that bother us to actual acting out or harmful behaviors of our students. For example, those of you who know me on the webinar, and some of you do, I sometimes bounce my legs a lot, like up and down. Some people say it's a nervous habit. Sometimes I'm just kind of thinking and processing. It's usually under a desk or a table, and not many people notice it, but at times this really bothers people. And it's not like I'm doing anything harmful, right? It's just kind of an irritant. Think of this as your students sometimes, right? Does anyone get really irritated when a student clicks a pen back and forth? We need to be able to distinguish what irritates us in the classroom and what is actually something that we need to correct in the classroom. So we're going to do a little fun poll here. I hope you can be as honest as possible about what irritates you in the classroom. And I came up with my own list, but I'm sure there's more. So what irritates you in the classroom? Select all that apply. Students talking out of turn, like Lewis did. Students playing around, students on their phone, or fidgeting. So take a moment and fill that out. All right, I'm going to close it in about a minute or in a few seconds here. So get your, if you haven't yet clicked on your answers, please do. All right, it looks like people are kind of finishing up. I'm going to share this out. You might be interested in what people are irritated about. It looks like, you know, there are some different commonalities here. A lot of us find it irritating when students talk out of turn or play around. And those are pretty, like, that's a pretty general category. Students on their phone. The fidgeting doesn't bother us as much, which is good to see because we know that, you know, especially boys, I think, need to have kind of more physical movement during the day. I'm glad no one, you know, not that many of you are upset by too many questions, but like Lewis, I know I could get irritated by a student asking question out of question. So the other thing to think about is most of these were pretty harmless, but we also need to be ready for students to say things that might offend us, right? Oftentimes the teachers students care about the most are the ones that students hurt the most. So remember, we need to quit taking their behavior personally and remain relatively rationally detached. This doesn't mean you don't care about students, right? You do, you show them care, but it means that their behavior is relation to them getting their needs met or something that's happened to them and not a personal offense to you. So one thing we do at Mercy Home is we fill out stoplight plans, and you will get one of these in your handout to kind of build your skills on self-monitoring yourself. And the first way to do that is to identify how you act when you are calm, agitated, or escalated. So kind of teachers brainstorm these into a red, yellow, and green category. And it's nice to engage in conversations about what we need when we're on those levels. So not just how we act, but what we need. This way, our colleagues can help us respond in a way that's helpful and not harmful. So for example, when I'm escalated, I like to go in my office and close the door. People know around here that if my door is closed, maybe just knock. And if she doesn't really answer, maybe come back later, right? But if someone really insisted on talking to me in that moment, that's not going to help me. That's going to, you know, keep me in that red zone. Really, most of our students, at least mine when I was teaching, really knew what I needed when I was angry, right? So when you like get upset, they would know, oh boy, Miss Simari is really angry. She's sitting at her desk really quietly and looking at us, right? Or like she always goes for the chocolate drawer when she's frustrated. Right, so we need to model this healthy communication about our emotions to students. We need to recognize it ourselves. So there'll be a really great resource that's emailed to you in the handouts. And really a hint with this is you can use this with students too. Is once you build your own self-monitoring skills and share it with your colleagues or do it in a team meeting, you can change the forum and make it for students. And so they can share with you when they're escalated or agitated, how they're acting. So my last slide here as we transition to Liz is starting to think about other things outside of the classroom that are affecting our ability to control our emotions inside the classroom. Right, student behavior that's not the only things that's impacting our emotions in the classroom. Our lives outside of work impact us as well. For example, lots of stress or our own trauma history is likely to impact our reactions. A lack of support from fellow teachers and administrators, that's going to impact our reactions as well in the classroom. If we don't feel like we'll get any support when we're disciplining a student, I might get more upset when I'm disciplining them. So this is kind of a nice transition to Liz. We want to be aware of these things and make sure we are getting the support we need. Liz is going to talk about kind of how we get this support and how we can analyze what we need and how to get it. So I'm going to take a moment and switch my screen here. So be patient. All right, here comes Liz.
All right, well, thanks, Andrea, for helping to frame the conversation more so around exactly what's happening in the classroom. And I have some questions to start us out, and a lot of this is going to be a combination of sharing my own experience and asking you to do some reflection as well. So as I'd mentioned earlier in the introduction, my training is specifically as a school social worker. And I worked for 5 years in a charter high school in a community that I would describe as really high needs. I loved the work and the students that I worked with, but I also felt myself starting to burn out by year 5. So there are things that I would do differently for my self-care if I could go back in time. And, you know, I was young, ambitious in my 20s. And I think there are some things that I would tell my younger self to change, things that I have learned over time. So these are things that I try to teach now to some of the younger staff that I supervise as well, and what I hope to enlighten you with today. So the framing questions for your reflection, what's causing you stress, and thinking about what is in your control. Andrea mentioned, you know, many things that aren't in your control, but there is a certain mindset that I want to be able to talk about today that is in your control. And when it comes to better wellness and self-care, there are likely some barriers, and we need to be realistic about what those barriers are. So in looking at how we can change things, we need to be realistic about what can change in the classroom that's likely more in your control, what can change in the school, and what can change outside of the classroom or outside of the school. So to begin, I want to first talk about sources of stress and burnout. And I have 3 different definitions here, and hoping that some of these will speak to you. First is the definition of vicarious trauma, which is a common term in the counseling field. And it's that emotional residue of exposure that counselors have from working with people as they're hearing those traumatic stress stories and are becoming witnesses to their fear, pains, terror that trauma survivors have endured. And while this acknowledges specifically counselors, I know that teachers are at the front lines, oftentimes being the first ones to learn about the trauma that students have experienced outside of school. Secondary traumatic stress is that ongoing exposure to other traumatic stress, and that you yourself may develop traumatic stress reactions in response. And lastly is compassion fatigue, that teachers may also experience compassion fatigue when overextending themselves to understand and empathize with others. So going back to one of the poll questions that Andrea asked, feeling bad for things that are going on with your students outside of school. And that's a really common reaction. And people go into teaching because they have big hearts and they want to be able to help kids as much as they can, and certainly try to understand and empathize their students. But with that, we can tend to overextend ourselves, leading to what's called compassion fatigue. So want to launch our next poll question and ask that you select all statements that apply to you. And this will help to get to the next slide that I'll show. So go ahead and answer any that apply to you. And even if you're not a teacher, but you're within your first 5 years as a professional, I'd encourage you to click that one as well. Okay, I will go ahead and close out the poll. And share out the results with you. So looks like a really high percentage of you work directly with traumatized children. So you're here on this webinar to get resources for that. So that's great. Also, a good number of you are feeling high daily stress that impacts your health in teaching, and that is significant. And so we want to be able to talk about, again, that mindset and some things that you can change on a daily basis so that it can have so you can hopefully have less stress and have a more positive impact on your health and teaching. And many of you acknowledge that you experience burnout, fatigue, and irritability. Good thing is that we didn't have anyone respond that your disappointments, the stress and disappointments aren't worth it. Because if so, I'd say you're probably at the point of burnout if that was the case. So glad that we don't have that, but that is certainly a real thing. And then if you're within your first 5 years of teaching, 14% of you said that you are, and that's an especially vulnerable time in your teaching career. So want to be able to make sure that you're getting the support that you need early on. Okay, so I pulled from a bunch of different research to look at some sources of stress and burnout, and some of these statements will look familiar to you. So as I explained previously, educators who work directly with traumatized children are particularly vulnerable to that secondary traumatic stress, leading to teacher burnout, fatigue, irritability, and other symptoms. Based on some research that I found, 46% of teachers say they feel high daily stress, which compromises their health, sleep, quality of life, and teaching performance. And when you think about this in comparison to other people who may be in different professions, that is a really high number. If nearly half of teachers are saying that they're feeling that high daily stress, that's impacting your daily life and impacting your life outside of school, outside of your job. The stress and disappointments in teaching at this school aren't really worth it. There were 50% of teachers in one research study that showed that. And again, that is going to then frame out the attitudes that teachers are bringing into their classroom, into their teachers. And the reason I pointed out the first 5 years of teaching is the research varies, but I found a few different sources indicating 30% to 50%. So within that range, 30 to 50% of teachers leaving the profession within their first 5 years of teaching. And when you look at Andrea and myself as examples, I worked in a school for 5 years and Andrea for 4 years. And we were ready for something different after that. And we still work within the field of education, but not in a school setting anymore. So that was sort of an aha moment for Andrea and myself as we were putting this webinar together. And last is just the attrition rates. The attrition rates of first-year teachers have increased by about 1/3 in the past 2 decades. And so when you look at teacher training programs, it's really important that we're giving that support to those first year teachers, and that's going to impact, you know, the next 4 years and then the many years after that. So clearly we can see that there are lots of sources of stress and burnout in research, and I encourage you to look at some of the sources that are mentioned at the bottom of the slide. There's a wealth of resources specifically about stress and burnout, and then of course we want to find the solutions for that. So a lot of this is around building that awareness of where is that stress coming from, and that mindset that I mentioned. So this is really about recognizing it and being self-aware. So there is a book that I particularly want to highlight, and it's by Laura Vander Lipsky. And the title is Trauma Stewardship, and Every Guide to Caring for Self While Caring for Others. And if you want a good read, if you really want to get better at your self-care, I highly encourage you to read this book. So this concept of trauma stewardship is that our stewardship involves, but is not limited to, our intention in choosing the work that we do. Again, we didn't choose to go into the choice wasn't made lightly to go into the field of teaching. Our philosophy of what it means to help others, the tone our caregiving takes, and caregiving, as Andrea explained previously, caregivers as teachers, and our daily decision about how we live our life. And so Laura Vander Lipsky goes through this process of really a lot of self-exploration. And so, like I said, if you want to get better at caring for yourself, this is a highly recommended read. So there's a few other tools that I've, besides the book, that I wanted to mention in terms of recognition and self-awareness. One is a self-care assessment, a really simple tool that will be emailed as a resource for you. And it's just a really simple checklist to look at different domains of our lives and ways that we can take care of ourselves. It's an easy review, just with the checklist and being able to put some of the pieces together, ways that you can change. The other is a more research-based professional quality of life survey, which will also be shared out and will also be really enlightening for you in terms of understanding sort of where you are in the stages of stress and burnout in your professional career. So the other thing that I want to look at is the personal and professional impact, because we recognize that our professional lives are impacting our personal lives. And so here at Mercy Home, we usually do a simple PIES check-in, and that can be with staff or with our kids. And usually the PIES are physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. And I stuck that second P in here for professional, just as a way to introduce this concept to you. So this is a really good way to think about our lives through different domains and how we're doing, and having just sort of a self check-in. There are a few different research-based solutions that we are drawing together for this webinar. And at the individual level, it's really what is in our control, that we can be supported through early recognition of stress, self-care, and trauma-informed support systems. And so with today, by being on this webinar, it's showing that you want to be able to recognize it and take better care of yourself. And really the bigger picture is at the organizational level. And the research has shown that programs for mentoring, workplace wellness, social emotional learning, and mindfulness are all proven to improve teacher well-being and student outcomes. And so while this might be harder to change overnight, think about what you can change in your school. Think about what you can contribute to initiate mentoring and workplace wellness. What types of conversations can you have with those around your school building? So to be a little bit more practical about self-care, we need to be able to make some plans. And so thinking about what we can do on a daily basis, weekly, monthly, and yearly basis, because our daily actions help to build up to making some changes that can take place over time. So I encourage you to think about what you can do on a daily and weekly basis, and be able to make a plan for the next month. So here's an example of a self-care action plan. Include those daily and weekly activities and include a few different domains of self-care. So again, thinking about those pies: physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. Be purposeful, concrete, and realistic. Assess those barriers because they will exist, but how can you be held accountable? Here we have some examples of a toolbox of things that you can utilize on a daily basis. First, adding a ritual at the start of the day, whether you enjoy that morning cup of coffee or tea, hydrating, or using some relaxation strategies. Some in-the-pocket strategies that I like to call, the ones that are the self-monitoring skills that Andrea talked about earlier. Having built-in breaks, which I know can be really tough in the middle of a chaotic school day, but it's really important to use the bathroom, hydrate, have some healthy snacks, stretch, walk, or take a 5-minute vacation, wherever you want to escape to. Refuel your personal self at the end of the day, so tending to your pies outside of work. And then finding a support partner at school and a support partner outside of school. It's really important that we can have people help to hold us accountable, but also help to join us on this journey of self-care. So I currently have a self-care action plan. I started off the new year and made it through the end of January and into February and still doing well with this. So I have a ritual to start my workday, and one change that I made is I previously would come in pretty well prepared to just start my day and run to the first thing that I needed to do. But I've made sure that I come in earlier to have some time for reflection and really think about my priorities for the day. I've been doing a water challenge with some people from my family, making sure that I stay hydrated and being intentional about that and really limiting my caffeine use. Having 3 meals a day plus a healthy snack. And when I worked in a school, again, I wasn't in the classroom, but I always ate lunch. If I did eat lunch, it was always after the kids' lunch periods were over. So I ate lunch, it was really late in the day. And by the time I went home, I was really in need of a good meal. But I think it took me a while to recognize that. Another thing that I've been intentional about recently is having no screen time 30 minutes before bed. So I find myself reading more books, but also making sure that I'm taking time to focus just on myself and my family. So not checking my work email or my personal email, just to make sure that I have time for myself. And I think this is, a really good practice. Certainly could challenge to have more than 30 minutes before that bedtime, because the work is always going to be there. But at some point we need to turn it off. I'm currently striving for physical activity 3 days per week, which doing pretty well with. And even if I'm really tired at the end of the night, I take out my mat and I have some free apps where I'm just doing exercise at home, feeling a lot better as a result of it. Taking time for reflection at work and outside of work, having a visual reminder at my desk for both what my personal and professional goals are. And then I have a little group me chat with my accountability partners outside of work, so that we can support one another. So just an example of what my current self-care plan is, and hopefully some of my ideas are ones that you may want to utilize as well. So we're gonna switch to showing you a couple of visuals from my self-care action plan, and also have some time to open it up for questions before we wrap up the webinar. Okay, so a couple of things that I brought. Got this plant. I have plants around my office. They bring me happiness. I can tend to them. I water them. My Friday morning routine is to water my plants. It just brings me a little bit of happiness throughout the day. Healthy snacks, yogurt. And guess what? It got to be time to come over to do the webinar, and I had not eaten my healthy snack for the day. So I'll eat it afterwards, but I keep these out on my desk usually, because if I keep them in my bag, I forget that I ever brought them. This is my fun little water cup. It has goldfish on it, but really important to hydrate throughout the day. A few little regulation tools. These are really big at Mercy Home. We use these with our youth, but also we bring them to staff meetings because people really enjoy them. So this is a little tangle, and then a little stress ball brain. And last, here's my little visual that I keep by my desk. We made these with our team a couple weeks ago. So we all have vision boards in our offices. So it was a nice little team building activity focusing on self-care. So hopefully those give you some good ideas. We do want to take time for questions before we wrap up our webinar today. So feel free to send those questions and we can answer them.
So this is Andrea. You can type the questions right into the question box, or you can put it into the chat. We'll be able to see it either way. It could be about self-care plans. It could be about caregiver affect management. Feel free to throw some at us and tell us what you're thinking.
All right, so one question is, how do you know when you are burned out? Well, I can talk a little bit about my experience. I started to measure how many times I would go home crying, and that is a horrible thing to say. And again, that's not common in professions, but I was having some really hard days, and I'm not much of a crier, to admit, but I knew I was becoming burned out when I was leaving and going home crying. Some other times is when I found myself living in like 12-hour cycles. So being at school from 6:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. and starting it all over again. Again, that's not really normal. So those were some big indicators for me. I think some others in terms of knowing when you're burned out is really, what is your intention in going to work every day? And are you feeling happy? Are you feeling fulfilled in your work, and that you're really serving the students the best way that you can? And if you're not, it's really time to look at what needs to change, and what with your self-care can change so that you can be better for your students. All right, so another is, how do I get better at taking care of myself when my job is so time consuming? And like I just mentioned, sometimes we work those really long days, and oftentimes we're also bringing the work home with us physically, bringing, papers, or having to do grading at home, or doing planning at home. And I think it's so important to pay attention to those different domains in our lives and making sure that we're taking time for ourselves. Again, going back to our pies that I mentioned, that we're tending to those areas of our lives. And then I think the other thing is those accountability partners. Think of the people who know you best and know you on your best days. If you're having a bad day, they need to help hold you accountable so that you can take better care of yourself.
I would also say, just to add, this is Andrea, everyone, is, sometimes we need to prioritize ourselves over our work. We can't take care of others if we're not taking care of ourselves. And I'll oftentimes remind myself that, even though I like to also tell myself this isn't about me, it's about the kids, but sometimes at the end of the workday, it really is about you. And you can't be an effective caregiver or an effective teacher or an effective social worker or even administrator if you are not taking care of yourself. So one thing we'd like to tell particularly principals when we're working with them is that it's really important that they're modeling this for you. So if they're not, they can't expect you to answer emails at 10 p.m. and they also cannot be answering emails at 10 p.m. And so we do know, I think, with our work at Mercy Home, is the more that our like managers and supervisors model self-care, the more that everyone else does too, and it becomes a positive place to work. So, you know, I think Liz mentioned about that accountability buddy, but this is something where we can kind of feed off each other. I know if like someone around here is going to yoga after work, it'll be like, oh, maybe I should go to the gym, or maybe I should do something that's gonna like kind of fill me back up. So you can keep putting questions into the question board of the chat. As we kind of finish up here, I'm gonna put I'm gonna enter kind of our Survey Monkey evaluation into the chat. We'd really like it if you could complete that even right now. That would be great, so we can keep improving our webinars and improving what we're doing to help teachers in schools. Just to sum up here, we kind of, you know, we talked about the impact of trauma on the brain briefly, but really focused on having supported caregivers, and that really creates a safe and productive classroom. And most of all, it creates a classroom that can learn. So really, if you were to take one thing away, we'd really want you to know that taking care of yourself is really also taking care of your students. And it's important to be aware of your reactions in the classroom and what's impacting those reactions. So really appreciate if you fill out the survey. Thank you for joining us today. We'll have another webinar in April, and we hope you can join us then too. You'll get an email on Monday that gives you more information about Mercy Model in Schools and Mercy Home if you have referrals or want to learn more about our work. You'll also get the handouts and another opportunity to fill out the survey. So thanks so much for joining us. We hope everyone can leave work tonight and go do something for themselves and care for themselves and start thinking about their own self-care routine in the school year. So thanks so much.